point is about the Great Rethink is that the world is, as I think everybody knows, in an absolutely appalling mess. So bad that very serious people, not just sort of, professional gloomsters, are saying we'll be lucky to get through the present century in a tolerable form. And I'm now well past 70, and therefore, as it were, on the last leg. And being purely selfish, I'm almost glad that I'm on the last leg, because I feel I've seen the last of the natural world, and the last of sort of ordinary standards of being and behaviour. And we really are just heading for the buffers on every front: economic, political, ecological, moral, religious, etc. You name it. We seem to be going downhill very, very rapidly. And the worst feature of all, which people don't really draw attention to, is that the people we look upon as leaders are actually, they hardly seem to be in touch with the real problems of the world, and all have their own personal agendas and are all leading us in the wrong sorts of direction. I don't know if anybody here has any real faith that COP26 coming up in November this year in Glasgow will actually solve any of the world's problems, but I frankly don't. I just don't think they're going to be addressing these problems, because I've been to these conferences before, and all the nations that are there basically fight their own corner. Basically they say whatever's going on in the world is not really our fault, and basically they just try to come out of it intact, and whatever they promise, try to make sure that they can carry on doing the same thing as they were doing before. We're supposed to be living in a democracy. The world as a whole, most of the countries in the world claim to be democratic, but in practice we're actually ruled, dominated by an oligarchy of big governments like ours, like the USA, like Russia, like China, in cooperation with the big corporates, the transnationals, in collaboration with the great financiers, all of them supported by intellectuals and experts of the kind that they have chosen to say the kinds of things that they want to hear. So we're not only in a bad state, but we're continuing to be get worse, and the people in charge aren't really focused on the problems, and insofar as they are, they're leading us in the wrong kind of directions. So what we actually need, which is really the reason for the title of my book, is a complete cross-the-board rethink. In other words, we need to be radical in the proper sense. Radical in the proper sense means getting down to the roots. It doesn't mean being an anarchist necessarily, and it doesn't mean being a terrorist. It just means that we need to get down to the roots of things, and we need to get down to the roots of things on all fronts. And what we in fact need is a renaissance, a global renaissance, a rebirth, which I would suggest has got to be more radical, more deep-seated, more deep-rooted than the Renaissance that brought the Middle Ages to a close, more or less, at the end of, roughly in the 16th century, starting at about the 14th century. That Renaissance was brought about by intellectuals and artists and bankers, and the Renaissance we need now has to be brought about by people at large, all of us. Ordinary Joes without an E, because the powers that be, the oligarchs, are not actually seriously focused on the real problems of the world. And I and friends, we are now establishing a new college to be called the College for Real Farming and Food Culture, and we're making pretty good progress. We'd have made much better progress if we hadn't been held up by the epidemic, but we're making pretty good progress. And the point of the college is to rethink on a very broad front, to contribute to the rethinking, to identify the ideas that are really worth pursuing, and to promulgate those ideas. Now with luck, these two boards here show a diagram. Do they show a diagram? I'm sure they do. Great. And you will see from the diagram that it consists of a series of balloons. I'm calling them balloons, which are ellipses. and they're arranged in 4 tiers, and I'm going to rush through what the 4 tiers entail and what the various bits of it entail, and just highlight the points that really do need to be rethought. The first, as a general point, is that everything we do in life ought, I suggest, to be a response to 3 questions. And the first of those questions is, what is it actually good to do? What should we actually be trying to do in this world, and why? And the second, and that's a question of moral philosophy, underpinned, of course, by sort of metaphysical considerations. The second big question is, what is it necessary to do in order to achieve the good things that we want to achieve? And the third of the big questions is, what is it possible to do within the limits of the present world? And the second 2 questions are actually matters of ecology. So what I'm going to suggest is that everything we do in life ought to be guided by the fundamental principles, what I would call the bedrock principles of morality on the one hand and ecology on the other hand. Now, I suggest to you that the powers that be, the people that actually have real control in this world, dominance in this world, don't think in those terms at all. They're absolutely not thinking about what is it morally right to do, and they certainly are not thinking about what is ecologically necessary and ecologically possible. The third point I want to make is, well, I shall skip that, and I'll move on to the point that although we need to rethink everything across the board on all fronts, we really do have to start somewhere, and we really do have to focus. And I'm suggesting, which is why I think I'm at this conference, that the place to start and the absolute focus of our deliberations should be agriculture. Agriculture, I suggest, is by far the most important thing that human beings do. The thing that we absolutely have to get right. It's at the centre of all human affairs, and it's at the centre of the natural world's affairs. Whether or not other creatures survive depends very, very largely on how we choose to farm. And all the big human problems of the world, including the inequalities and the injustices and the starvation, the famine and the privation, all of them have very strong roots in agriculture. And some of the main ecological problems in the world, including climate change, agriculture is a crucial player. And I'm inclined to say on the conservational front that unless we farm in wildlife-friendly ways, then the rest of our fellow creatures have hardly got a prayer. In other words, the cause of wildlife conservation is almost dead in the water unless we farm appropriately. If you look at my diagram, it's arranged in 4 tiers. The top tier is marked goal, and we really have to define what it is we're trying to achieve in life. And I submit that governments don't do this. I mean, it's absolutely essential to know what you're trying to achieve. And all governments have in mind, as currently, is this thing called economic growth, without any real thought to how the growth is going to be achieved or what damage will be done by trying to achieve growth, or by what kind of a world they want when the growth has been achieved. But growth is the thing they focus on. And then they sort of, well, what's the word, decorate this with ridiculous slogans like make a Britain great again and take back control and all that kind of stuff. And it's all nonsense, it's all flannel. We need to define clearly what we're trying to achieve. And what I'm suggesting, which is a sort of premise of our whole college, is that what we should be trying to achieve is convivial societies, societies in which we can all feel comfortable and at home and so on, with personal fulfillment. Because, you know, there are many political systems which have thought in terms of the society and have forgotten the individual. And there are other political systems that have concentrated on the individual and forgotten the need to have a decent society. And I'm suggesting that you need both, convivial societies with personal fulfillment. But, And this is the thing that almost all governments in the history of the world have overlooked. We have to look after the natural world. We have to embed convivial societies with personal fulfillment in a flourishing biosphere. And please note the word biosphere, meaning living world, and not the word environment. The word environment, which governments like and corporates like and so on, is a purely anthropocentric concept, and it means surroundings. And we are supposed to value the natural world because of the surroundings are nice, and in the neoliberal economy, surroundings means real estate, and this becomes the reason for looking after the natural world, and it's not good enough, it won't do. So that's the goal, convivial societies, personal fulfillment, a flourishing biosphere. We're told, incidentally, by Jeremiah's in high places, that it's impossible for human beings to achieve convivial societies because we're incapable of sustained conviviality, because the modern dogma has it that we're all supposed to be very competitive and out for ourselves and self-seeking. And that is not actually common experience, and a great deal of modern biology, if anybody's interested, I hope you are, suggests that's just not true. The best survival tactic actually in life is not to compete for personal advancement, but to cooperate. And the cooperation, the need to cooperate, which is part of the need to be convivial, is actually a Darwinian prediction. So the idea of conviviality is good science, as well as being good morality. And the idea that we should all be competing for personal advancement is actually bad science, as well as being very, very bad moral philosophy, and yet it's what actually dominates the direction of the whole modern world. The biosphere, the living world, excuse me, to look after the living world, the biosphere properly, wildlife, first of all, we have to give a damn. This seems to be obvious, but actually, when you think about it, ask yourselves, do governments like ours really give a damn about the natural world, except insofar as sometimes it contributes or can be made to contribute to wealth, to GNP, etc. And at the moment, the terms, the sort of the words that dominate conservation theory, conservation policy, insofar as it exists at all, are those of natural capital, meaning that we can value the wild world because of what it's worth, and ecosystem services, meaning we value woodlands because they help to prevent floods, for example. Again, that's not good enough. These anthropocentric concepts are not good enough. If we're really going to do, because what happens is that as soon as anything in the natural world gets in the way, we zap it, irrespective of the collateral damage, because it's just getting in our way. And actually, if you seriously want to look after the natural world, you have to take the rough with the smooth, and you have to start with the assumption that the natural world is important too. And the assumption that the natural world is important too, and that individual creatures, apart from us, also matter, is partly a matter of morality, coming back to the beginning, also a matter of metaphysics, actually, which I'll come to later, to do with our attitude towards the world as a whole. The second tier down on the diagram is marked action. And action includes everything that we do, obviously. And among everything that we do are all the technologies. And we have to ask ourselves, not just how to make smarter and bigger and better technologies, but what do we actually want technology to do and why? And in other words, we should be homing in on the idea of what is appropriate technology. And appropriate technology is the kind, I suggest, that contributes to the goal of convivial societies, personal fulfillment, and a flourishing biosphere. And I suggest to you that most of the technologies we have now, some of them do contribute up to a point to what we really want in life, but a great many of them don't. And that's not the criterion by which they're developed. Technologies are developed in the neoliberal world largely according to whether they can be made profitable and whether they will concentrate wealth in not many, in fewer and fewer hands. And people have thought very seriously about how, not on the one hand how we could develop technologies that are good for us, but on the other hand how we can ensure that they really are good for us. And the people who I single out in my book who have really thought about this include Rousseau at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the Industrial Revolution, who pointed out the sort of aesthetic drawbacks of industrialization. The Luddites, who were written off as being just kind of, quasi-terrorist hooligans, and some of them were hanged, who were actually thinking about the very serious problem of how do you create technologies that do the work but don't just put people out of work. And then John Ruskin, who asked why should we produce anything by craft, by hand, when he could do it so much quicker by manufacture, and gave very good reasons why you should. And Morris, William Morris, who picked up from Ruskin, but then went on to say, well, actually factories can be useful too, and ask about basically the philosophy of the factory. And then Tolstoy, who picked up, who very much was concerned with traditional agriculture and traditional technologies, and then Illich, who talked about tools for conviviality, and Schumacher, who coined the expression appropriate technology, and then Tim Berners-Lee, who invented the internet and actually gave it to humanity, and a good friend of ours, Michel Pambert, who talks about the need for traditional technologies. Return to these. These guys, these people, have created something that can properly be called the philosophy of technology. And the philosophy of technology is essential, and it's not actually taught. What's actually, well, very rarely, what's actually taught is how you can make bigger and smarter technologies without thinking about where they really lead. But two technologies in particular are of key importance, and the main one, as I've suggested, is agriculture. And the kind of agriculture we need is what I've been calling enlightened agriculture, otherwise known as real farming. And enlightened agriculture is compounded of two different ideas. I think they're different ideas, although they're often put together as if they're the same idea. But two different ideas, which I certainly didn't think of. One is agroecology, which to my mind is treating all farms as ecosystems and treating agriculture as a whole as a positive contributor to the biosphere. And the other part of enlightened agriculture is food sovereignty, the idea that all societies should be in control of their own food supply. Now, if you put the two together, in other words, create enlightened agriculture, you say, well, what we really need is agriculture that is very diverse, because that's very sustainable and so on. Low input, because that also is sustainable and so on. Put those two things together and you're saying what we really need is organic agriculture. You need the agriculture to be very mixed, because then everything can interact with everything else. If it's mixed and low input, it is bound to be complex. If it is complex, then it is bound to be skills intensive, meaning you need lots of skilled farmers and growers, not meaning that you have to have lots of slaves, different thing entirely. And if you have enterprises of any kind that are complex and skills intensive, then there is very little advantage in scale up. In fact, there's usually no advantage in scale up. So we can say the enlightened farms we really need are almost bound, logically and in practice, to be small to medium sized. Now that's, to me, eminently logical and undeniable. And yet it's the complete opposite of the kind of agriculture that is now being abdicated and promoted by governments like ours and governments like America's and governments like Russia's, which are geared, whatever they may call themselves politically, they are not designed to provide good food for everybody. They are designed to maximize and to concentrate wealth in fewer and fewer hands. And the kind of agriculture we see now in all the fields, most of the fields around in this country and in East Anglia and so on, are these huge monocultures tending towards minimum to zero labour with huge inputs, geared to the maximisation of production, geared to maximum production. And the reason they're maximising production, they say, is because the human race needs all this extra food. And that's not the reason at all. The real reason is that the more you produce, the more you can sell. So in theory, it ought to be most profitable. And the whole thing is geared to profitability in accord with the dogma, really, of the neoliberal economy. So the kind of agriculture we have now, high tech, high input, etc., is called, very anomalously, conventional, but it should be called neoliberal industrial. And neoliberal industrial, which is becoming the norm, is the precise opposite of the enlightened kind of agriculture that we really need. If you focus on enlightened agriculture and you create farms that are ecosystems and which don't encroach too much on the natural world, you will find yourself focusing on plants, on arable and horticulture, and on mixtures of plants. And you'll find yourself fitting in animals, livestock, where they fit. In other words, you will be raising herbivorous animals, mostly ruminants, on the hills, wetlands, drylands, and you'll be using omnivores, pigs and poultry, to fill in the gaps mop up surpluses virtually, do a bit of cultivating, and mop up the leftovers on a mixed farm. If you do that, then you're not producing much meat, but you certainly are producing some. There's no real case, there's no ecological case for veganism. So what we finish up with, if you practice enlightened agriculture, which is designed primarily to provide good food for everybody without breaking the rest of the world, is plenty of plants, not much meat, and maximum diversity. And these 9 words, plenty of plants, not much meat, and maximum diversity, serendipitously also summarise the best of nutritional theory over the past 60 years, which tells us that the diet should be moderate in protein, low in fat, high in fibre, full of micronutrients, and full as possible with what I call cryptonutrients, things that are even smaller and more esoteric, recondite than vitamins, but are very important and are coming on board. People are beginning to realise the importance of cryptonutrients. So what you could say is that the kind of agriculture we need, enlightened agriculture, is entirely in accord with modern nutritional theory, which is, to me, a huge serendipity. We farm well, we should eat well. But there's a further serendipity, which is that if you look at the great cuisines of the world, the greatest cuisines of the world, on an axis from Italy to China, taking in Turkey and Persia and India along the way, all of them are based on the sort of formula of plenty of plants, not much meat, and maximum variety. All of them use meat sparingly, usually as a garnish, sometimes as a stock, often as a stock, and only occasionally in bulk for feasts. So we can say there's a wonderful one-to-one correspondence between good farming, sound nutrition, and the world's best cooking. And all we really need, we don't need all these fancy ersatz foods that we're told are going to save the world. We don't need to be vegan, we don't need to be too austere. We just need to relearn how to cook, to focus on good traditional cooking. We come back to the generalization which applies to all technologies, that very often the real solutions lie in traditional technology, traditional practice, rather than developing something new and fancy. The third tier down, I shall rush because I want to have some discussion. But the third tier down is called governance. It's called infrastructure. And infrastructure has three components. The first is governance, how we organise, who's in charge, how we organise our affairs. The second is the economy, and the third is the law. And again, I suggest that all three of them are in a pretty disastrous state. Just a few generalizations about government. Tolstoy asked the question. Tolstoy was hardly a sort of revolutionary, but he asked the question, do we need governments at all? And he concluded that we actually don't. And he said Russia, certainly at the end of the 19th century, would have been much better without the government that they had, you know, the czars and the bureaucrats, than it was with those people in place. I think it is unfortunately the case that we probably do need governments in a modern world like ours, a very complicated world. But we should be asking them some very serious questions, or we should ask ourselves very serious questions. The first is really, is the government actually on our side? Does it actually care about us? Is it actually trying to do things that are good for humanity? And they're not good simply for the party or for the people who actually support the party. I don't know whether any existing political parties, certainly not the two major ones, could answer that question honestly. There's one little, I think to me, the greatest principle of politics is the one that's in the New Testament, in St. Mark, chapter 42, I believe, where Jesus is said to have said, whoever would be first among you must be slave to all. And the idea that government ministers should actually devote their lives to us as opposed to devoting their lives to lining their own wrists or furthering their own careers is absolutely vital. And yet, how often is that actually the case? Is it actually the case with the people who are now in charge? The economy, totally off the wall. One of the most huge mistakes that people have made in the history of economics, particularly perhaps economists themselves, is to suppose that economics can be a science. Marx thought economics could be a science. The modern neoliberals, totally opposite end of the spectrum, apparently believe that economics could be a science. And they try to reduce it to very simple ideas. Marx had very simple formulae, which they say they would sort of prove as like a scientific formula. Like Marx had, workers should own the means of production, and the neoliberals have, you know, the global market will sort everything out. You should not impose any rules on the market, the free market will do it all. What many people have pointed out is that actually economics cannot possibly be a science because it doesn't have hypotheses that you could seriously test in the way that is characteristic of scientific hypotheses. You could only put up big ideas and hope for the best and try to bring a bit of evidence, which is not the same thing at all. It's a very uncertain pursuit. And the results of what happens, there is a non-linear relationship in economics writ large between what you do and what actually turns out at the end of the day. Economics, like everything else, should serve the great goal. It should help to create convivial societies, help to enhance the lot of the individual and look after the biosphere. And I suggest that the present economy, and in fact probably no economy in the history of the world, has ever addressed those three problems seriously. And the present economy is obviously not good for all. It creates inequalities, etc., etc., etc. What we actually need, just to cut to the chase, is something that lots of people are calling green economic democracy. And that actually depends on a mixed economy, not just government ownership and private ownership, but a tripartite mixed economy, where one of the most important components is the community. So we should be looking for government ownership, community ownership, and personal ownership. The whole thing, of course, should be geared not only to the well-being of human beings, which it obviously isn't, but should be geared also to the well-being of the biosphere as a whole, which it really isn't. And in my book, I discuss what the neoliberal green economy really does involve, which is very different from what we have. And the final thing, the final component of the infrastructure is the law. And again, we should be asking making the fundamental demand that the law must be on our side, and asking whether it really is, and suggesting that the law must be trying to achieve convivial society, personal fulfillment, etc., and ask whether it really does. And also that the chief focus, I think, for law at the moment must be to do with the law of the land. Because the idea that now prevails, which is that land can be treated as a commodity like anything else, is frankly disastrous. Again, that's a huge area that needs thinking about. The last tier down, mindset, 4 components I suggest are of outstanding importance: morality, science, metaphysics, and the arts. I'll just make a couple of sentences about each one because, as I say, I want to stop and have some discussion. The first is on the matter of morality. Modern people, and in fact lots of people in the recent history of the world, have been saying you can't have a universal morality because morality is relative. Morality is what individual societies say is good. And of course, according to the neoliberals, good is defined as what will succeed in the global market, in the competitive global market. In other words, good in the modern world, in the modern economy, is what people are prepared to pay for, which seems a very crude definition of good, but that's in effect what it is. I'm suggesting, and other people have suggested, that actually there is such a thing as a universal morality. And if you look at all the great religions of the world, and indeed at most of the traditional religions of the world, you find that they all have a moral core, which is very, very similar. And they all emphasize the need for compassion. The Dalai Lama never stops talking about compassion. Every chapter in the Quran, except one, I'm told by a good Muslim friend of mine, begins by an appeal to Allah, the compassionate one. And the concept of compassion, of course, is very similar, if not the same, as the Christian concept of love. The Christian theologian told me that they're different, but frankly, I can't see the difference. Compassion must be seen as a universal moral principle. And the second great universal moral principle found in all the religions is humility. And again, one of the characteristics of the modern world, of modern science, modern politics, modern economics, is extreme arrogance. The idea that we can control the universe, the idea that one group of people is superior to another group of people and should dominate their people. This is all illustrations of a lack of humility. And, as I say, humility has been emphasized by everyone. And the Greeks, to the Greeks, the greatest sin of all was actually that of hubris, which is the opposite of humility, which is actually trying to usurp the power of the gods. So humility is the second one. And the third great principle, which is universal, is the idea that we should treat the living world, the biosphere, with reverence. And we don't. It's pretty damned obvious. The second component of the mindset I'm suggesting is science. Science is what I do. Science is my background. I think I love it. I think it's vital. It obviously is vital. But it's been horribly misconstrued. And people, including a lot of scientists who should know better, have been thinking that science is somehow the royal road to truth. And the simple truth is it isn't. And again, I analysed in my book what this means. You could never prove anything. You could only at best disprove things. And as Sir Peter Medder was saying, he was a great biologist from the mid-20th century. Science, in the end, is the art of the soluble. And scientists are as confident as they are and come up with such strong theories as they do, largely because they focus only on those questions that they know they can answer. It's like a great tautology. And the logical positivists simply said that any question that science can't answer is a nonsense, a non-question, nonsense, rubbish. And the third thing I want to say about science is that it should be taught as a cultural and spiritual pursuit, as it would have been in the 17th century, and not simply as a way of creating new technologies of a lucrative kind. The third thing down, one of my balloons there, is marked metaphysics, and metaphysics is the thing that's most important, actually, and it's the thing that's gone missing from the modern world. Metaphysics exists at the heart of the world's religions, but it doesn't exist as a discipline in its own right anymore. And yet, metaphysics asks the fundamentally what people have called the ultimate questions. What is the universe really like? What is true? How do we know what's true? How do we know what's good? And how come things are as they are? We can explain how they work, but how come they're there at all? And these are the great metaphysical questions. And metaphysics has come up with big ideas which are quite different from those of moral philosophy and quite different from those of philosophy in general, one of which is the idea of transcendence, which is that there's more to the universe than science could ever hope to explain. And the second is the idea of oneness. And you put these ideas together and you come up with metaphysics that's produced the idea of the sacred. In other words, there are places that human beings, just as it were, thoughts and ideas and places where human beings just can't go. And we've lost the sense of the sacred. And I would say that was, everything is now a commodity, everything's up for sale. And I would say that is one of the prime causes why the world is in such a mess. And finally, the arts, very, very important. In two sentences, first of all, the arts, as far as I'm concerned, represents the human mind in free flight. It's following the imagination where it will go, and it takes us to places we wouldn't otherwise have been. And the second great contribution of the arts is that it's the joker in the pack. It causes us to question everything else that we do, which is a very important thing to do. So this is, in a nutshell, the agenda of our college, to discuss all the things that need to be discussed in order to put the world back on an even keel, as seriously as that's possible at all. And it seems to me that, you know, in a meeting like this we could discuss very, very well, very in great depth, what agriculture is all about and what it should be trying to achieve, and strength to its arm. But we're never going to achieve that unless we also achieve the rest of the background, different governance, different economy, different mindset, different science. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Colin.
Well, thank you.
Plenty to think about. Anybody want to start the discussion going? I can hand you the microphone. Ah.
Yeah, hi. Most farms have to specialise in production systems that suit their soil and...
Sorry, I'm a bit deaf, you know.
Okay. Most farms have to specialise in production systems that suit their soil type and climate. So how do you move, and they're therefore more specialists, so how do you move from that situation to a more integrated and eco-diversified system that you're advocating?
That is, of course, as it were, the key question to which I don't have a simple answer. A generalisation is that farmers obviously have to make a living in the short term, just as all of us do. Because if you don't get the short term right, then there's no long term. So yes, you've got to do that. And to make a living in the short term, you have to some extent to compromise with the status quo. And so, economic and etc. And so, as you say, farmers, for all kinds of reasons, have in practice, the things are to specialise. It's a huge pity that actually the short term is very often in conflict with the long term, but that is the case. The only solution that I can see is that farmers, while they are focusing on making a living, which they have to do, also keep what one might call a weather eye on the big picture and say, okay, I'm obliged to do this, but I would rather be doing that, if you see what I mean. And all the time be alert to possibilities of doing other things. I mean, one of the ways in which mixed small farms are supported, the only way actually in which they can be supported, is if local communities give a damn, and if they create local markets that the farmer can feed relatively small amounts of stuff into. So the task for farmers, as far as I can see, is a sort of double. On the one hand, making a living, which I sympathise with, and on the other, trying to create a better future, as it were, on the side. It would help, of course, if the NFU was on side with this, which of course, on the whole, it isn't. A lot of communities, I think, aren't they, on side with this. There are very good things happening, which are precedents and so on and so on and so on. It's not a very good answer because it's very, very difficult to answer it, but that's part of it. The other thing is that we've got to do the rethink. So the more that farmers can contribute to the whole rethinking process, and the more they can sort of raise questions and make life awkward for the people who are now in charge, I think that was all grist to the mill. Best I could do. I wish I could do better.
Thanks. We've actually just heard from DEFRA in another lecture on the sustainable food incentives and the environmental land management scheme. I was wondering what your take was on that, considering what you said about the commoditisation of land and the biosphere, because that seems to be exactly that. Basically, we are incentivising, that sort of thing.
Could you possibly summarise the thing again?
Oh, sorry. So in another lecture, we heard from DEFRA talking about the sustainable food incentives, which is kind of what some people have talked about as a very new policy to re-incentivise farmers to change their land management practices. But a lot of that is based upon incentivising farmers for things like biodiversity creation. And that seems to be going against what you were just saying, which was basically, the commoditisation of certain environmental aspects. Yeah.
Look, I think most of what DEFRA says goes against what I've been saying, or most of what I say goes against what they're saying. I mean, there's some very good people in DEFRA and on the right side and all that stuff, but they are stuck in to the status quo. They do represent the status quo. They are supporting that they are stuck with the neoliberal economy because they don't know anything else. And I can't address that in detail, partly because I can't hear well enough what you've said, but I mean, I hear. This to me illustrates the need for much broader thinking than DEFRA is ever able to bring, and the need therefore for everybody who gives a damn to do the thinking for them actually, and to create the alternative. Basically that's it for the time being.
I could summarise what was going on there. It was about public goods for public services, and it was a sustainable farming initiative, and it was about paying farmers to manage their land in a way that so the ecosystems can thrive and they can sequester carbon and so on. And is that in support of what you're saying, or is it against what you're saying?
It's half in support. I mean, it sounds good, public good for public services, but again, public good is defined, as far as they're concerned, primarily in economic terms, I think. And if you ask the question, do they actually really give a damn about the living world, the biosphere, in terms other than natural capital and environmental services and all that? The answer is it's not really on the agenda at all. The metaphysical dimension is not there, the sense of the sacred is not there. And when it comes to human well-being, I guess, as I said, it's assessed in material terms only. So it's kind of better than just saying we should just spend money to make corporates richer. But it's nothing like where we need to be, I think.
Are there any areas in the world which you would aspire to in terms of being closest to your goal that we could perhaps visit and learn from?
And we.
Did you not get that?
Are there any Are there any areas in the world which you would point us in the direction of, where they have got the goal much more in line with your goal, or the goal you described?
Well, there are, yes. I mean, the place that people always mention in this context is, of course, Bhutan, where instead of talking about increasing income, gross national product and all that stuff, they talk about increasing in gross happiness, which I think they define largely in spiritual terms as opposed to simple hedonistic terms. So people like that. And then you can look in any traditional society and you find that they have a sense of values which is not that of the neoliberal material world and so on. However, the characteristic feature of all those groups, traditional wisdom one might call it, is that they don't actually have any real power. And the real trouble is that the people who want power and are the people who focus on power and focus on money, because money is power. So actually, yes, there are plenty of societies, and there certainly have been in the history of the world, that are saying things that are very much in line with what I'm saying. But it's very difficult in the present world to see how they can ever become to dominate or ever have real power, real influence. And this to me is the central thing. How do you turn these kind of moral and spiritual ideals into actual practice when you're up against people who only care about money and material and dominance? But the answer is yes, there are. Bhutan is one.
Sorry, it's not a question, it's an addition, and hopefully in answer to the gentleman's question. We are making some links with a state called Andhra Pradesh in India.
Oh,
and there's a program there called Zero Budget Natural Farming.
Right.
And it's funded by the government in India to capture 6 million small-scale farmers that exist in that country. Now, they've been going through a high suicide rate because of the pressure of joining into the global agronomic system, the food supply system. And as a result, they've been trapped into a corner which has led to high suicide rates. So zero budget natural farming is aimed at working with the small scale farmer to bring around a better way of growing food at a small scale that builds community. So I wanted to just put that in as a case study or as an example of how that might happen. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. I think the work of Vandana Shiva too in India is of huge relevance here, don't you?
Thanks, Colin. You described how we're stuck in a system with the wrong goals,
Yeah.
which I'd agree with. Just wondered from a kind of, I'm not a farmer, but lots of farmers in the room, on a practical level, what would be your message for what farmers should, or those involved in farming, should do to try and help, contribute to the great rethink? What's your kind of practical message for farmers?
Yeah, it does actually occur to me that farmers who are already, as it were, stuck in the system will probably find it harder to change the direction of the way that's necessary than new farmers coming into it for the first time. Although new farmers coming into it for the first time find it very difficult to get access to land. That's one of the key issues. But for example, one chap who's demonstrated very well that the small mixed farm, etc., can work, who can make a living out of it, is Ed Hamer on Exmoor, who you may well have heard of. He made the point, because he's quite hard-headed, that you have to start with the marketing. You have to make sure before you do anything that you're likely to have a market, a small market that you can cotton onto. And you have to have the community on side. And these are the kind of preconditions. But if you're already stuck into a system where you're growing commodity crops for Tesco, they're very hard to switch, particularly, of course, if you've got all your capital invested in mega combines and all the rest of it, which need big combine and big fields and monocultures and all the rest. I've got some, I mean, my sympathies lie with existing farmers, but I've got more faith in the new farmers who can come in. I reckon in this country, and this is my own thought, I mean, I've had conversations with good farmers, and I've said to them, how many more farmers, how many more people would you like to employ on the land, your land, in order to make it the kind of agroecological farm that you yourself would actually like? And the kind of answer I get is somewhere like 8 times as many workers or 10 times as many. In other words, there's an appetite even among many farmers themselves to vastly increase the sheer manpower of good, or person power of skilled farmers in this country. So 8 to 10 times as many as we have now. One way in which that happens, there are various people. Unfortunately, one of them I know has now moved on, is retired. But James Odgers, I don't know if you've heard of him, in Somerset, who's had he only had about 200 acres, which he bought because he was a rich man, but he deliberately divided it up into different enterprises with different farmers running quasi-independent enterprises on his own land. That is a way forward for fairly well-heeled people to bring new people in. But it's the new generation, I think, that we need. I think. Sorry? Oh, I couldn't hear that.
There's hope. Yes, James Odgers is a very old friend of mine. We trained to be solicitors together in the late 70s in the city. And certainly my children have been involved in James's enterprise and speak very, very highly of it. I just wanted, thank you very much for what you said. I was very struck by the link between compassion, part of morality, and as you say, a value espoused by all the great religions, and convivial society. And when we think of convivial, we think of sort of eat, drink and be merry, but of course it doesn't really mean that. It means living with, living well together with.
Exactly.
And I think the link between compassion and convivial society, and it's been seen actually over COVID in plenty of rural communities where people have been looking out for each other and being happier as a result, despite all the challenges. So I echo the gentleman in the back, there is hope.
Yeah, good, yeah. It does strike me that, if you wanted to define, Shatu, what you really want governments to do, well, actually what you really want to do is to encourage good things to happen. And one of the good things, the best thing, is to encourage, the way I put it, is create the kind of atmosphere, economic, etc., in which it's possible for what Abraham Lincoln called the better angels of our nature to put their heads above the parapet. I mean, nowadays, as they say, nice guys come last, because it's this ultra-competitive world. If they would help to create a world in which that wasn't the case, then the innate sort of niceness of human beings, I think, does almost invariably come to the fore, doesn't it?
It's very easy to blame it all on the government, that they've got to come up with all the solutions. But the way I sort of tend to look at it, there's a big problem that your average person just wants to spend as little as possible on food as they possibly can, which means going to Tesco's or wherever it is, and they are not the slightest bit interested in what us farmers here today and tomorrow are trying to do, which is to make the countryside a better place. And the government are pretending to tell us that they want that as well, but I don't really believe it, like you. But I can't see how we get over the problem that your average person just wants to buy food for as little as possible. They don't care what it tastes like, they don't care where it comes from, and they definitely wouldn't understand what the nutrient density of it or anything like that was. I'm just wondering how you think we can possibly get over that problem.
One answer is that it does seem to me, I know that all these answers are glib, but it does seem to be that Britain, traditionally for the last 200 years, has killed off its own food culture. And what you're saying is unfortunately true. Most people don't give a damn, most people don't know what good food is. And really, I mean, we were the first people to industrialise, as you know, Britain, and industrialisation produced a whole class of urban people who had no contact with the countryside at all. And as George Orwell pointed out, okay, 130 years after the Industrial Revolution got started, that people were forced for generations basically to live on bread and scrape and tea, which they recirculated the tea bags. I mean, it was killed, the knowledge of what food really is. There are other societies in which that's not true. I mean, in India, for example, I don't generalise about all of India, but you see people living on, I've seen this, living on the streets in what was then Bombay, now Mumbai, cooking beautifully with all sorts of spices, with a single sort of flame on a row of brass pots. Or you go to, even today, modern rural Italy, rural France, and people build their lives around food. And they haven't got much money, but what they do have, they spend on good food and they spend on conviviality. They have a food culture which we have lost. I mean, I don't think we probably ever really had it to the extent that those countries did. But the task is to revive food culture, and that's why it features heavily on what I've got on that board. And cooking seems to be, agriculture, one could say farming, is the most important thing, but cooking is the thing that complements it. Everybody should be aware of. It isn't, I mean, at the moment, you look at the television schedules, there's probably about 20 different cookery programs on at any one time. But so that sort of looks as if it's moving in the right direction, but it looks as if people care. But actually, they're not really, most of the time, talking about what's good traditional cooking. They're talking about some fanciful examination. But I agree with you that the task is to recreate real food culture, and other societies demonstrate that this is still possible. We can't give up. And I wouldn't put all of my faith in the government, rather the opposite. I think we actually have to, as much as possible, take power away from the centre and refocus it on communities, actually.
Well, it's an hour's up, if no one else has got...
There's a lady there.
Lady there?
So I'm going to play slight devil's advocate here. This notion, we have to be very cautious, I think, when we communicate about what the public thinks about food. And we have to be very careful about where we receive the information about what the public thinks about food in our farming press. Because it is not to the benefit of the corporations for the farming community to recognise that in large Maine, as it stands, they're not growing food, they are growing commodities which go into a food manufacturing sector which makes money out of marketing inappropriate nutrition to a public that has been long since separated. Way before we had the Industrial Revolution, we had the Norman Conquest. That's where most of our culinary heritage came from, because we didn't have that much beyond our beans and our pulses that we were eating because we didn't have the topography to be producing the sort of Mediterranean vegetables which have been incorporated. And the British food culture now is not an English food culture. It is a culture born of many cultures that live in our country that have contributed to broadening our palate. And it's not that people aren't interested. We live in a neoliberal environment where people working in the food sector beyond farming, in processing and in manufacturing and in gig economy service, who are being paid just as little as many farmers are. So yes, I understand entirely what you're saying here, but I think that we have to be very cautious about damning the public for not wanting to pay more for their food when the constructed retail environment makes it almost impossible to really select anything beyond the cheapest. And it's not in the interest of the food manufacturing industries for us to start cooking our own food made from locally grown ingredients. So we are living in a paradigm that doesn't want us to shift to where everybody thinks it might be better that we went. Sorry, I'm feeling a bit ranty.
I agree, but I don't really see why that's devil's advocacy, because I agree entirely with what you're saying. Can I just say one last thing? The other thing that strikes me about the price of food is not that the food is too dear, because in my opinion it should usually be a lot dearer than it actually is. What makes it look terrible, or what makes the price look unacceptable, is the huge income inequality in this country. And some people in this country earn 1,000 times, literally, more than others. And so long as that's the case, you cannot have a sensible price for food. Because what actually, if very rich people ate what one might call ordinary food, they wouldn't notice the cost of it. It would be point something of a percent. But for poor people, it can represent 30-40% of the whole income. You've got to go really deep to find the causes. You're agreeing with me, exactly.